Okay, welcome everyone to our first webinar of the new academic year. My name is Nathan Alexander. I'm the project manager with the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. And today we're going to be hearing from Abby Day, who is, I've just learned, an Anglo-Canadian. Uh, and she's going to be talking about her recent book, Why Baby Boomers Turn from Religion, Shaping Belief and Belonging, 1945 to 2021, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Abby Day is Professor Emeritus of Race, Faith, and Culture at Goldsmiths, University of London. She is Executive Editor of the Association for the Sociology of Religion, past Chair of the Sociology of Religion Study Group within the British Sociological Association, a member of the ESRC Peer Review College, and a member of the UK's Office for National Statistics on census questions regarding ethnicity, identity, language, and religion. Her recent books include How to Get Published and Win Research Funding from 2023, Why Baby Boomers Turn from Religion, the one we'll be talking about today, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization, Practical Tools for Improving Teaching, Research, and Scholarship, which is edited with Lois Lee, David Thomas, and Jim Spickard, and Sociology of Religion, Overview and Analysis of Contemporary Religion from 2021. So we'll hear from Abby Day for about 30 minutes, and then the remaining time we'll do for Q&A. So take it away, Abby.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nathan. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me and for all your help in the preparation for today. As Nathan said, I'm an Anglo-Canadian. I was born in Canada, lived in Montreal and Ottawa as a child. Then we shifted out to the West Coast, so I was mainly raised on Vancouver Island. And despite my accent, I have been in Britain since 1981. Don't know why I still sound like I've just got off the boat. But anyway, people often ask me, they say to me in England, oh, what part of America are you from? And I always say the Canadian part. So that's partly why, and you'll see as I talk about this work, that I talk about Canada as well as the UK. Part of it is because I had, in more recent years, an association with the University of Victoria, particularly for the fantastic Centre for the Study of Religion and Society, but also because there are some comparable themes. And one of the main themes, as I will be going through, is the shared institution of the Church of England or the Anglican Church of Canada, which is part of the worldwide Anglican Communion. And I think there's a lot that resonates there. So I will now get into my presentation. All right. Are we good there, Nathan? We look a little bit.
Oh, good. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so Professor Emeritus, I've just retired actually from Goldsmiths, from teaching, etc. But I still have a few projects I'm carrying on with. So yeah, it's nice to be able to be still in the saddle, so to speak. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically this piece of research. And I'm going to go, we will keep it moving along, but please, don't hesitate to make a point as when we finish the discussion, and I'll go back to it and elaborate if you'd like, because there's a lot to cover. So I don't want to spend too much time on any one point. But as I say, I'm very happy to continue later. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about a piece of research that I did, particularly in 2021. There's two parts to it really: qualitative research with 53 interviews in the UK and Canada, mostly the UK, and some secondary research. We can talk later about this as well, because there has been some discussion about conducting research during COVID times and how that was and how it worked out, and what I might give you some sort of feedback on that. But I won't pause on that right now. Thanking everybody for all of very much their participation, my interviewees, of course, for their ideas and their encouragement. I've changed everyone's names and identities. My department at Goldsmiths for funding this through Research Lead, for the Centre for the Study of Religion and Society at UVic, for hosting me as a fellow, both to discuss this project, but also the previous project about the religious lives of older women, and now, of course, those of you here today. And I'm really hoping for a discussion afterwards, particularly because this is the first time I have presented this to a Canadian audience. I did the very preliminary emerging findings back at UVic 2 years ago, but as a whole, I haven't presented this to Canada. So very interested in your feedback. Just a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about on the key findings. My key findings is that the baby boomers, by and large, that I studied, don't believe in God, and yet we shouldn't write off their beliefs in other forms of some kind of higher entities, most of which I would suggest are related to their deceased relatives. So they don't believe in God, but they do believe in ghosts. And I can discuss why I think that's so. They didn't, as many might have predicted, fallen into some kind of immoral, self-centered abyss. And it's funny, I feel this comes up quite a lot when I'm interviewed about this book, about, well, what will happen if they don't go to church anymore? And I'm finding that actually nothing happens in terms of their morality. In fact, one of my main arguments that I brought through this research is that many people believe their sense of morality is better than the church's. And I'll discuss this as I go along. It's not that they didn't have any sense of community or meaning, but they found different practices and different sites for community, meaning, and even transcendence. And they transmitted those values, those non-religious values, to future generations. And that helped shape, I've argued, the religious identities of their children, and we might argue their grandchildren. Some of the Generation X, millennials, and now Generation Z and onwards. And those values have much more to do with being more liberal, more ethical in many ways, more concerned with equalities, collaborative, and connected. So those are some of the findings that I hope to be able to touch on as we go through. Now, this book's been out for a couple of years now, and I've had mixed reviews. I'll just summarize a couple of those because I think maybe it'll help the discussion. It's been generally positive. People like my interviews, the insights, the way I've compared to other research findings, and some of my original ideas. Some of the pushback, and I appreciate these comments, and you may want to develop these in discussion. Some people in particular suggested that I didn't go back further enough in how these generations had the coming towards non-religion. I certainly accept that. I went back as far as their parents, let's say those born in the 1920s and 30s. But there is a longer tail to this, and that could be more developed. I did interview quite a few humanists for a lot of reasons. One, they were accessible. And some people suggested that may have skewed my findings. I've tried to explain in the book, and we'll discuss this more. I don't think it did, because a lot of the humanists I interviewed weren't hardline atheists in the sense of being campaigning. And also, I found that their views didn't really differ much from the non-humanists. I'm being accused of being too dismissive of Max Weber's emphasis on meaning, and I accept that. I am dismissive. I think Weber overplays this idea that everybody is in search of some sort of metaphysical meaning. I think that's overplayed. And I think what comes out of my research is much more of an emphasis on meaning as it affects one's relationships, one's everyday life, family, and those sorts of things. So I know a lot of people in religious studies, and some of our, known scholars and previous scholars would say that there is this insatiable search for meaning, for something higher. I'm not convinced of that. Another critique, and again, I think this is worth discussing when we talk about the churches, is it's been suggested that I should have looked at more than one religion. Well, I learned when I was doing anthropology that it's actually almost advisable to hold one institution stable. And in particular, I wanted to hold the institution of the Church of England stroke Anglican Church of Canada stable. Not only because that's interesting then to make some comparisons, but also because it has a place in the national imagination of a kind of national church. And also, as other people have pointed out, the decline in Christianity has been felt most keenly in the global north and certainly the UK and Canada by those in the Anglican Church, as opposed to other denominations. So for a lot of those reasons, I stuck with the Anglican Church. Also, it follows on from my previous research about Anglican lay women, and in particularly important because the women I interviewed, I was fascinated by what appeared to be their devout nature of Christianity, and yet the very obvious missing link of their adult baby boomer children. As Linda Woodhead had said, that the Anglican numbers have halved, and these are being much more keenly felt. And I've got some views of why that may be so than other denominations. So let's begin there. And this is where I left off originally when I had that last book about older Anglican women. And what I was really interested in was how these older women were certainly, and showed me to be very, I showed them to be very devout, very dedicated, going to church all the time, polishing all the silver, baking the cakes, having the cake sales, doing everything that we, knew as young people. I knew as looking at the older women in the church. What I was interested in was why they were so active and why their children were not. And I sometimes asked them, well, where are your kids? How come, they haven't followed in your footsteps? And I sometimes got a lot of, half thought through answers like, well, they're busy or they have to take the kids to football. And then one woman somewhat snapped at me in a way that only that older generation can snap and said, well, why don't you ask them? So I said, okay, right. Next book, I'll ask them. That's what I tried to do. So I came to the conclusion that that was what my next piece of research should be, finding out what happened to their children. Not only their children, the baby boomers, but how the baby boomers then went on to raise the least religious generations, well, ever, I'm saying, it's a big claim, provoking the rise of what we see as the nuns, or I would suggest no religion, in the UK, Canada, elsewhere in the global north. And this is the story, I suggest, of generational decline. And what happened there? How did these, I would say, quite pious and devout women manage to raise children, baby boomers, who rejected that religion? And I don't think many people have studied that particular relationship. And that's what I wanted to dig into. And so in digging into that, I had to look at lots of statistics, and I mostly like to look at the Church of England statistics because they're pretty well, aligned to this, that, as they say, the evidence for this decline was indisputable. As the Archbishop said, we're in a demographic time bomb. I think everybody's quite aware of the demographic of the Church of England and the Anglican Church of Canada. So I had a sample of people I wanted to contact, and my criteria was very tight. I wanted to find people who were born, 1945-ish, I suppose, baby boomer. Again, with any generation, we can talk later about what we mean by generation, but I'm not looking to be absolutely severe about the cohort, but I was looking generally for those people who were kind of 1945-ish to around 1960. I wanted them to have been former church attending Anglicans. I wanted them to have attended the church with their parents, to have been baptized and confirmed in the church, and then to have left the church. That was quite a tight sample, because that was what I was looking for. How come they were born and raised into the Anglican church by their church-going parents and then stopped going, and as later raised non-religious children? So that again is a very specific sample. I wrote a book about it, which we can talk through in detail. I'm only going to focus on a few of the areas in the book. So a lot of it, which has to do with the chronology of their lives and how they were raised in the church and then how they drifted away, how some of them had very strong motivations, some of them just drifted, most of them just drifted, how they were affected by the times, for example, the Cultural Revolution, how they came into adulthood, how they and their children often continue to believe in spirits, although not in a deity, how this affected some of their belonging and their behavior, and what then the legacy is and has been and continues to be for the next generation. Now, I'm not going to go through those chapters one by one, but I pulled out just a few stories to illustrate, I hope, what we might be finding to talk about later and how I think this will feed into the discussion. So I'm going to look at three areas that I spent time with, from what happened to them when they were teenagers and this pivotal moment of confirmation and leaving. What happened to those who actually had a very strong sense they had to leave, this kind of claiming a higher moral ground? And then finally, how do we manage this idea of being non-religious and atheists and yet believing in spirits? So those are the three areas I want to touch on. So teen angst, what do we find here? Well, this will take some going back. One of the things I discovered and I hadn't really appreciated was the extent to which this generation was the first generation that were really involved in the Church of England and Anglican Church of Canada's new format of how the church service would be conducted by taking out the children at the beginning of the service and putting them into a separate room where they would have Sunday school. Now, this is very different than an English form of Sunday school that began a couple of centuries ago that was designed to teach children on a Sunday afternoon how to read and write and their academic skills and give their parents an afternoon off. No, this was actually in church time. So what did they do in those times? And the more I talked to them about it, and other people have done the same thing, they didn't do very much, a lot of them would say. It was a social time. They did a lot of coloring in, Mary and Joseph and the camels, they did all those. But they were the first generation, the first Anglican generation to be so segregated from the rest of the church. It must have had some kind of impact. So there they were doing Sunday school, not going to church. And then suddenly, around age 12 to 13, came confirmation. And then shortly afterwards, for a lot of people, came Exodus. It was a minister I interviewed in Calgary who had a lot to say about that particular period. And she described this as, she said, this weird thing that everybody notices. She said, we've noticed it for decades, that the children will attend the nursery school and the Sunday school, and then they're confirmed, and then they're never seen in church again. And she said that they jokingly refer that to graduation from church. So it's a phenomenon that people have recognized. And there's a lot of literature, interesting literature on the sociology of childhood, which talks about some of that, some of these small acts of agency and institutional power. But when I asked the baby boomers what they remembered about this confirmation period, trying to work out why did they just leave all of a sudden, a lot of them couldn't remember a lot of the detail, and some of that was because, in their terms, we bunked off a lot of the time. There are a lot of them who pretended they were at the classes, but actually just went out with their friends. And some of them went to the classes but didn't pay much attention. There was something, as this young lad, Charles, I'm calling him, said, it was just something you had to do. You might as well get it over with. And he described it like going to a dentist. You might as well do that. You just stay on with the vicar and you do it, and you'd find out you'd have to memorize this and memorize that, and whatever, tick the box. So it was a tick box for many people. It wasn't a huge spiritual development. Now put this in the context of a wider society. And one person I interviewed when he was younger said he felt then that they weren't hearing anything they could believe in. When they looked through the detail, they looked through the catechism and what they're supposed to sign up to. And he just said, there's a load of tosh. It didn't make sense. Now, the parents who were still attending church, usually at the time, also didn't push back. Now, this has been sometimes, and I've read in other people's accounts, that apparently were too liberal. And this was a terrible thing they were doing, and it was a turn towards individualism. But wait a second. The parents are actually being theologically correct, right? Because we know at confirmation, that means that those young people were taking on the promises that their godparents had taken on their behalf. They were taking it on for themselves. They were now, in terms of the church, adults. And it was now up to them to do what they wanted to do. So the parents were correct by saying, well, it is up to you. Now, there's one boy or one man said, as a boy who remembered, his father said, oh, what was it? They didn't worry about it. They were perfectly normal. They were like, fair enough. This also links to something I won't go into a great deal here, but I was pinpointing in my book something I referred to as parental ambivalence. I think that generation that went through the war, that then gave birth to the baby boomers, was a lot more ambivalent about religion than I had suspected. I think there was a great deal, particularly on the mother's behalf, that made them not quite as embedded in their religion as we might have thought. And I think they did actually have more leeway. They wanted to grant more leeway that they couldn't themselves take. So what is this load of tosh? Well, why would they believe it? They'd been segregated from the church at Sunday school. They hadn't really been with any sort of collective worshiping as in a Durkheimian sense. They always told me when I interviewed them, they didn't have any sense of anything spiritual. They didn't recall when they were at Sunday school feeling close to Jesus or feeling close to God. And in terms of belief, and I've worked on the idea of belief for a long time, in terms of believing as in something that was deeply held, well, they never really did that anyway. And so it wasn't that they rejected their church so much as a fact, in a way, they never had it. They never really were in the sense of being devout and feeling that they belonged in the bosom of Jesus. That was never really their kind of background. So they exodus. They were frustrated. They were frustrated with what was being told to them that they didn't agree with. And in the time period they were in, and some of them remarked to me about this, they were often being encouraged at school to question things. Their parents were questioning. There was a whole ethos now going on in the early 60s of questioning. There was a lot of damage that people were uncovering about the war. There was a lot of discussion about human rights. So this was a period where people were questioning things. It was the beginning of a worldwide huge expansion in higher education. And so then the milieu of which they were being now in their teenage years and towards adulthood, this is very much a sign of the times. And so leaving or drifting away was easier for them and something that, in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised at. As David Oswell, who does a great deal of work on the sociology of childhood, would say, the children often had their own creative bricolage. They kind of had their own way of doing things. And sometimes we, as adults, don't appreciate that, how much work goes on. And I think a lot of work was going on with them at that period that made it make absolute sense for them just to not bother going again. Most people I interviewed had that experience of just not bothering going anymore. It didn't make sense to them. Now, one or two did have stronger senses of a kind of higher moral ground that was to them, and they used the term a couple of times about this blinding light on the road from Damascus as they were doing this. And one person even described it as an epiphany. So we see that they are still quite schooled in religious language. And one person I interviewed just had this great story about how he pretty well left the church, but he wasn't, really sort of sure about it or hadn't really thought about it much. And he was at a conference and he was saying to me, he was at a conference in the United States, and this is a British man, and he was just reading the newspaper over breakfast one day. And there was a period of time when there was an election going on. And the Catholic Church had taken out a full page ad saying not to vote for certain candidates because they were in favor of birth control and abortion. And the Catholic Church has said this was just terrible. And it was really just similar to genocide. And so we should not vote for them. And he said he could not believe that. He said, this could not actually be true. They couldn't seriously compare contraception or even abortion to genocide as being equally bad. He said, that's when I realized the Roman Catholic Church had completely lost its moral compass. And that was in his words, his final straw. So he thought that his sense of morality was much better than what the church was advocating. And there was also people who talked about being aware of the hypocrisy of the church. And one British guy I interviewed remembered when he was younger and was very poor. And in fact, they didn't have running water or running toilet in his house. As he said, he had to stand on a brick to pee in the toilet at the back of the house and backyard. And a friend came over and just couldn't believe it and was really quite dismissive. And that was the first time that Paul became aware of real class differences, he said. And then he thought, well, wait a minute. Do you mean there's differences in society and some people look down on other people? And then he recalled the people he saw going to church, as he described all those upper class snobs practicing their religion on Sundays and not during the rest of the week. So there was this sense that he had, this horror of somebody's hypocrisy and being, we might call them Sunday Christians, right? And feeling, how can people behave like that in that sense of a class-based immoral behavior? So those are just two examples, but certainly throughout my interviews, I did get this sense of a real moral clash that was going on. That people, the baby boomers I was talking to, were feeling at that time, as they were growing through teenagers years and adulthood, this rejection of a sense of patriarchy. And men and women talked about this. It wasn't just the feminists who were looking at the whole idea of hierarchy and was this legitimate, who were wrestling with ideas of hypocrisy, of abuse of power, and in really concert with the times. Let's not forget the UN. That was the UN period of their parents' generation, actually, who were creating the UN in mid 1940s and onwards. Periods of, they were being raised with periods of equality, of human rights, of relationality. And this was very much, they saw, different than what the church was preaching. And the ideas of the church seemed much more about authority and much more about structure and about hierarchy. And of course, then they saw some of the inequalities in the church. And some of your own research, I know, and some of the people that the Canadian scholars have talked about are much more aligned to these ideas about equality. We can see Paul Bromadat's work on Cascadia, Laurie Beeman's work on the environment and equalities. And these are very strong and not so much anti-religious, but we'll say, let's suggest non-religious values. It was also, I found, quite a strong sense of I describe as an end of theodicy, whereas it seemed that previously people could work out ways that they could justify why the all-powerful, all-loving God would allow bad stuff to happen through either ideas about free will or how maybe God was testing their faith. But as one boomer said, come on, if there is a God, couldn't he just be nicer? So they didn't anymore feel this need to excuse God for bad things. And in that sense, it was easier to give it up. And my third and final point on one of my findings will be about the belief in spirits, or what I am calling here extraordinary relationality. I know, just drops off my tongue. I don't have another term for it, so anybody else can come up with it, please do. I'm kind of pitting myself against Tyler, whose definition of religion is good, but also misleading, as he described it as religion is belief in spirits. And it still carries through to this day, but that's fine. But let's not forget, as I was arguing at the beginning of my work on the subject, that belief in spirits is not necessarily religious. And this is what I'm finding here in my research. As one boomer said to me, I find it easier to believe in the paranormal or in ghosts than I do in God. That was certainly what I found when I did the earliest research in the 2005, 2006, when I interviewed the then millennials when they were 15, 16, and 17. And they were talking about this too. They said, no, they weren't religious, but, and it was always this but they had the sense that maybe their dead grandma was looking out for them, or their deceased brother was still in some ways there. And I was working that out at the time, and I'm still working it out, that there is a very non-religious sense of another world, which isn't even spiritual in their words. They wouldn't even use that term. What term do they use? Anthropologists talk about it in terms of continuing bonds, and maybe that's the right term. I struggle for the vocabulary. I really once very, very bad rookie error for a researcher to do. I'll just tell you this story, and then I'm going to start winding up. I was interviewing a boomer, and he was talking about being a humanist and not religious. But he said, sometimes things happen that kind of makes you wonder. And he said, when his son was very, very ill, he was sitting by his bedside in hospital. And Simon's father had died some years earlier. And he said he was so worried about his son. And then all of a sudden he said, it was like a hand was on my shoulder. I knew it was my dad standing behind me. And his hand was on my shoulder. And he was saying, don't worry, it'll be okay. Everything will be okay. And it was. His son was better. And then sadly, a few years later, his son got ill again, back in hospital. He said, same thing. I was worried. And then I felt again the sense that my dad was there, just telling me it was okay. I said, and it was okay. And so during the interview, he said, so that was great. And I said to him then in the interview, I said, oh, well, that's so interesting. Have you had any other supernatural experiences? And he said, what? Supernatural? I didn't say it was supernatural. It was totally natural, right? So me, researcher, imposing the vocabulary, it wasn't supernatural. It was totally natural. Is a way that, in this story here, I won't read it out to you, you can just scan it. A way that I suggest people keep their loved ones alive in some ways. They talk about them. They tell their jokes. They try to remember them. They keep them somewhere in their heads. So in conclusion, what does all this bring us to? Well, I think there's a lot of what I've studied here and would argue that conforms to theories that we know, maybe slightly embellishes on them. We know the significance of family in terms of religious transmission, or I would say in terms of religious non-transmission, or in terms of transmitting non-religion. The family is very key. Also, we can see the importance of peers and how that combines to help this, in my case here, some ways drifting away. We can see the importance of the community in terms of a collective. Perhaps some of the reasons that these baby boomers I interviewed didn't really get their religion was because they never really had it, never part of that collective. And also to other observations about generational decline, that these are ideas that are transmitted through generations. And so we find the millennials now, being the biggest growth, certainly in the UK and Canada, the biggest growth of a religious category of non-religion or no or none is with the grandchildren of the baby boomers. I think that we need a bit of theoretical revision here. I troubled a little bit Burge's idea of pluralism. I think that's a little overstated. Yes, when people went to university, they had loads of other ideas, but not really. They still have the ideas that they were raised with. And I think to a large extent, people were already aware there were different ways of believing things. And so we need to be careful about that, I think, and not just say it's because all of a sudden we're exposed to the idea that there are other ways of thinking. I certainly have always come up against Charles Taylor about his whole ideas and Brian Wilson's ideas about people doing their own thing and being individualistic. I don't see really much evidence of that. I think people are still highly relational. Don't go along with the idea that the reason the boomers gave up religion because they all went shopping on a Sunday. I think that's convenient to say it was consumerism that overtook the church. I don't think so. I don't think what we saw was just a lot of selfish shoppers. There were other longer term trends going on. I think we have to reconsider that as well. So that is the most of my presentations that I could get to. And I'm going to stop sharing this and hope that we can have a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. That was a really fascinating presentation. Lots to chew on, I think. Um, so we'll open the floor for questions. There's about 20 minutes or so for questions. So if you want to raise up your hand or type your question in the chat, um, then please do so. Ryan.
I'm always reliable for at least one question. Thank you, Abby. I actually read the book like a year ago, so I may not remember like all of the details, but thank you for one writing it. It was great. I enjoyed reading it. I do have multiple questions, but I'll let other people ask questions as well here. So let me start with one. You hint at it here in the presentation, but I'm intrigued, right? So I think you're absolutely right when you say like the argument that they were never really religious, so it wasn't hard for them to leave. I totally buy that. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I'm also wondering if there are other things that are happening in society, cultural shifts that have just made this much easier for people to leave. And you've hinted at it in different places, but I'm wondering if you could just be a bit more explicit of like what else has shifted in society that just makes it so it's a very easy transition for them to just not be religious. And I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thanks for that, Ryan. And I won't grill you on all the questions about the detail of my book, but thank you for reading it. And I've always admired your work. I know we've been in this kind of discussion for a long time. And the idea of the non-religious. Yeah, there's a lot going on. And I, talked a bit in my book about the 1960s and the trends towards things like individual thinking. Yes, there was I think, a lot of push about upturning some sacred cows. And they were part of that and seen part of that. But also, as I was alluding to, there was the idea that had begun in the 1940s onwards after the Second World War about human rights. It was a huge idea that there were other rights worth fighting for than just religious rights. I think they were being exposed to that. Um, I mentioned, and given we're in Ottawa, I might elaborate on this a bit. I think there was some existential crises. I touched on in the book, but not a great deal. Existential crises that occurred during a period of worldwide nuclear tension. Now, I can remember as a child in school in Ottawa, I was in grade two, I think grade one or two. So I'm talking about what, 1962, three, and during the heightened tensions around the Cuban Missile Crisis we had nuclear bomb drills. And as a little child, I remember those. The air raid siren would go off, and the big kids who were in grade eight would come running down to our classroom or kindergarten, help us put on our shoes and our clothes and our boots and our coats, and we would run home where our mothers in those days didn't work, right, mostly would be there to wait for us. We were terrified. What was going on here? How could we absorb this idea of nuclear destruction? But we were exposed to that. And I think the boomers, being a little older than myself, were exposed to that. And then it went through the 60s, a lot of that discussion. So there was an existential crisis. There was new kinds of music, new kinds of behaving that overturned a lot of what was seen as the right way of doing things. So the boomers was so much part of that. You're right. And then the worldwide expansion of university education. And here I think it's important when a lot of quantitative surveys suggest that there's a link between higher education and atheism either way. But I don't think it was the education that did that. I think it was the leaving home that did it. So this generation was the first generation that systematically left home to go to university. And there's a big wave of that during the early and mid 1960s. So I think, a perfect storm, all of those things coming together. Yeah, thank you for the question.
All right, other questions? Okay, Lori and then Guillaume.
Hi, Abby. Thank you for this. I read the book not as long ago as Ryan. He's always faster at reading books than I am, but I did read it. I enjoyed it immensely. And like Ryan, I'm grateful to you for this incredible contribution to the conversation. I don't know if you were at Doug Ezzy's talk at the ASR, but he also focuses on morality and that people have left and are leaving and are staying away from religion, specifically Christianity, because they are more moral in a sense rather than less. And so this kind of turns the traditional story, if you will, on its head. One of the things that really surprised me when I read your book, and I'm still kind of puzzling over it. And I also am really interested in whether Brian Clark has anything to say on this, was the idea that children didn't learn to be religious because they were in Sunday school coloring and doing other things. I had that experience, by the way, personally. But do people learn to be religious in church? I mean, did that really matter?
Yeah, that's a great question because I'm not convinced it did actually matter. I point this out because I think it's an important part of the story that they were segregated. The only thing I think could possibly matter isn't what they would learn in church, but the sense of a collective worship, the sense of a collective belonging to something. As you know, I quite like the idea of believing in belonging. And I think Sunday school didn't have that sense that we are a worshiping community. We are a bunch of kids having a nice time. And I have to apologize to any Sunday school teachers because I know there's some wonderful ones out there. And I think when I say all they did was coloring in, that undermines the fact that so many Sunday school teachers were doing other work. But I'm just saying what people remember that happened. And a lot of that they would say wasn't a big deal about religion. If we are taking the Anglican Church, it's probably even less likely than if we were looking at maybe, for example, a more charismatic church, because I'm saying, well, maybe it wasn't the collective effervescence that Durkheim would say was important for religion, but I'm not sure in a lot of Anglican churches, traditional Anglican churches, there would be a collective effervescence, except maybe for the evangelical wing. So no, I hesitate about that. I put it out there to say, no, this was the first generation. I think probably more important was the fact they didn't get anything at home either. And some people, Steve Bruce, for example, had an interesting remark that he suggested that one of the indicators of non-religion in the future and perhaps secularity was the extent to which things were being done at home. And he said in particular, the time that we stopped sitting, this family stopped sitting around the family Bible, there's trouble. And I had this story repeatedly from the baby boomers remembering their younger lives. Nothing happened at home. They went to church, they came home, end of. There was no other embedding of religion during their home. And I think you'll find that, I'm certainly some of the other literature I read about other churches, particularly the more Pentecostal churches, let's say, evangelical churches, a lot goes on at home. More goes on at home in terms of sharing scripture or other forms of religion. So I just think that between the Sunday school and the lack of religion at home, that the boomers were not that much exposed to what we call a religion.
Right. We've got a couple questions. Guillaume, and then Anne, and then Patience.
Oh, yes, thank you. And thank you for the talk, by the way. That was wonderfully put out. Experience shows, eh? I was wondering regarding this Sunday school factor, which you've just isolated a bit as being not so significant. But even though that wouldn't be necessarily the objective of your research, have you thought about doing comparative observations regarding this factor? For example, going through other studies in Catholic churches and their way of having transmission of dogma and theological information, and the way maybe that it's affected this same let of participants in the 60s.
I'm sorry, were you saying that as a question or as a suggestion? I think it's a good suggestion.
Oh, no, it was really a question. I was wondering if it's something you've played with even informally.
No, I didn't play with that. As I say, it's a sort of standalone chapter about what goes on in Anglican Sunday schools. I haven't done a comparative research about the extent to which other religions might inculcate children into that. An observation that from the baby boomers interviews that this Sunday school experience, that when I said, what was your earliest experiences of religion, was very much on the basis of this was a social experience. We went to church, we did our fun times in Sunday school. But even more widely, they said, particularly people living in rural areas, that the church was a social place. They went for their dances they had. The parents went to have, harvest suppers. So it was all the church as a social thing that became, I think, quite strong in my interviews and linked again with the Sunday school. And I don't know that we could ever do this again, because how could we compare, if we could, the idea of the people who didn't go to Sunday school? All I could say is their parents didn't go to Sunday school. The generation I studied, the religious lives of older lay women, those women who were born in the 1920s and 30s, who became the Anglican lay women I studied, they didn't have a Sunday school. Sunday schools really began late 40s, early 50s. So it'd be hard to dig out the comparison for that. So mine is a suggestion.
All right. Yes, thank you. And by the way, I'm thinking about Catholic Church in Quebec for maybe some equivalent. So yeah,
Okay, it'd be interesting.
Thanks.
Okay, Anne, please go ahead. Your audio doesn't seem to be working. Do you want to write your question in the chat? Okay, great. I'll read it. Maybe Patience, do you want to go ahead and then I'll ask Anne's question when she's got it.
Oh, okay, sure. Hi, Abby. I read I read your book like a month ago or 2 months ago, I think. And what struck me about your book was I'm currently trying to study non-religion in African communities, and I felt that young people now are kind of in that baby boomer stage where they're kind of like moving from their religious identities. Young African people moving from their religious identities from previous generations that are so strongly Christian or Islamic. And I just really saw like such a similarity. And then I just wondered if you had like any pointer for me in my study, like how do you think baby boomers were able to overcome their like fear of like social ostracization? Because you did mention that religion was not so religious in the sense, like they didn't really practice Christianity, but there was kind of like a social expectation of practicing religion for them. So how do you think they were able to like go through that process? And also, do you maybe suggest that they kind of had like a switch, or did they replace their like social religious identities with like something else? Was it like more like a switch, a replacement, or was it like a gradual process of detaching? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patience, for that. And good luck in your research. It's such an important topic. A very important point about social ostracization, because I think that was also going. The whole need to be seen to be religious was going. There's another study I quoted in the book, and I can't quite remember the person's name, about how it used to be the case that if you move to a new community in the United States or Canada, you'd kind of automatically almost join a church, not just because you wanted to be a member of a community, but because you wanted to show that as a sign of respectability. That people go, oh, yeah, you're part of a church, you're okay. But that started to diminish, apparently, according to this other study, during the 1960s, that people weren't doing that. And so the idea then was that so they didn't have this link anymore so strongly, that to attend church had to be a sign of social respectability. So I think that was going anyway, and has that wider cultural revolution that was saying this is not necessarily the only way to be respectable. In fact, in some ways, it was a backlash against some of the ideas of equality that suggested it wasn't necessarily so morally respectable. But there's a great deal of variation. There's still areas in the United States, particularly, you'd go to, where you would find that would have to be a mark of respectability. I gather still in the United States more than Canada that being an atheist or identifying publicly as an atheist is in some many quarters still very looked down on. So I think it's a regional variation, certainly in the UK and to some extent in Canada. The idea of the social respectability of religion was decreasing anyway during that period. Otherwise, I think you're right. There would have been a fear, and there is still a fear in certain areas. Um, did they? I have a chapter in my book I'm kind of fond of, but also a bit ashamed of. I used to do a lot of sailing. I think maybe I overdid the chapter on becoming, unmoored and how you put an anchor down when you're in a cove and everything. But I think that was the case, that because they hadn't got the anchor really embedded through their church or through their families, it was just easier for it to come loose. And so a couple of people did tell me, like the person who was at that conference, about how all of a sudden, no, he just had to suddenly say that's a disgusting thing the church is doing. But a lot of people, it was indifference more than it was a kind of outright rejection. And a lot of people didn't go from being semi-Anglican to a real identity as an atheist even. They just, stopped going to church. And then they kind of stopped identifying as it. And there was a tail, of course, where they might still, for purposes of whatever, some form they had a tick, say they were a Christian, until more recently that they would then say, okay, I have no religion. But there's still a tendency, certainly in the UK and in Canada, I think, to, when the question is asked on the national census, to sometimes identify the older generation, identify as Christian, because a lot of people would still say, older people would say that was almost synonymous with English. So if you're Christian, you're English. There's a racist element to this I talked about in my book on believing in belonging, where a lot of people wanted to deliberately put themselves apart from Islam. And so on the UK census, when they had those choices between, say, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, all of a sudden they go, no, I'll say Christian. But they're making a nationalistic point. But we find that that is much more the case with older people. The millennials generation appears not to do that, link so much church with nationality, at least in the UK and to some extent, as I understand, in Canada. But that may still be the case in other areas. So it's one to watch, I think, always, the degree to which people will tie together very strongly their idea of religiosity, nationality, or ethnicity.
Okay, I'm just going to read the question from Anne, and I think that'll be our last question for the webinar. Anne says, I'm a classic subject, Anglican in my youth and teens, but then drifted away. And the question is there any correlation of altruism as demonstrated in volunteering between present and ex-religious people?
I can't answer that. I don't know the literature on altruism, but I do know that volunteering, a lot of people suggest, is being going out the window, and that's because of individualization and other things. I think we have to look at what we mean by volunteering as well, because there's only certain areas that are usually shown and studied in terms of how people are performing. A lot of younger people may feel that their altruism or their sense of performance doesn't exist in, let's say, the traditional areas of turning up to a charity shop, but exists in different ways, exists in influencing, exists in ways that they show themselves on their social media feeds or other places, to be going with really strong ideas about, thanks for that reference, yeah, strong ideas about altruism and what that means. To a lot of people, that would mean environmentalism, for example. To a lot of people, that would mean fighting for the rights of LGBTQ plus, for example. So I think we need a redefinition of what we mean by voluntary, and not see it just as I studied in my book on the elderly Anglican women, measured by turning up to, church bake sales, or turning up to thrift shops. So there's a lot that we need to unpack and what we mean by that as well. So it's a complex question, and I'm not even sure that we have one answer for that. I certainly didn't see any decline in the idea of the importance of care and community. In fact, the baby boomer generation, people that I interviewed, had a very strong sense of that, and spent a lot of time, and I quantified it to some extent in the UK, a lot of time volunteering as unpaid grandparent babysitters for millennial children that could not afford to go out to work otherwise. So we need to look more broadly at what we mean, I think, by that. But it's a good area to look at. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Um, Thank you, Abby, for a great presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for your questions. I'm just including in the chat the notice about our next event, which is happening in a few weeks. That's featuring Ryan Cragen and Jesse Smith. They're going to be talking about their new book, Goodbye Religion: The Causes and Consequences of Secularization, which is just coming out next month, I believe. I think, is that right? Yeah. Okay, great.
Well done.
So I included the link there to register for that webinar. I also included a link if you want to sign up for our mailing list, the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project, to find out about our future events, new podcasts, any other research activities we're up to. Please sign up. Um, Other than that, I just want to thank Abby Day once again for a really fascinating webinar and for everyone for attending. Thank you.
Well, thank you for organizing and everybody for all your great feedback and questions. It's really helpful. Thank you.